Thank you everyone for joining. I've learned a lot myself about performance the last day and a bit, and I wanted to focus a little bit at the moment on like something really specific. It's not something big. It's not like performance budgets or observability like we earned earlier. It's also not about birds. It's about privacy regulations, and that's something that has been come up a little bit more over the last few years, but unfortunately, it has been hurting the performance. And I kind of want to give some tips and tricks that I've learned myself on avoiding letting GDPR or other privacy regulations hurt your performance. So a little bit more about myself. So, like I said, my name is Thomas Corthouts, and I think that's the first time that someone pronounced my last name correctly, like as a non-native English, as not Dutch speaker. Um, and I'm currently a software engineer at the growth engineering team at DataCamp. But after the last talk, I think I need to start talking to my manager to become a product engineer. So I was raised in Belgium, and that's the reason that my name also sounds Dutch. But I'm resided and I'm in lockdown in New York at the moment. And like I said, I kind of want to talk more about privacy regulation and how to not let it hurt your performance. And as an example, I would like to use GDPR, which is probably the most common known one. So GDPR, or Long General Data Protection Regulation, is a regulation that is instantiated by the European Commission. Kind of look at it as if all the states governor would kind of be the president of their own country, and the federal government only has legislative power over like a few specific things. Like that's kind of what like the European Commission is. Like they're like the federal government at that point. And privacy is one of the ones where they do have something. It's like where they do have a lot of power in like in legislating. Um, and one of the biggest misconceptions about GDPR is that it would only apply to European companies, which is not true. Um, I'm not a general counsel, so I might say stuff that isn't 100% correct according to law. I can read law and I can try to understand it, but I do not have a master's in law, so I might make some mistakes. But as far as I know, and as far as like everything that I've read online says, is that it doesn't apply to European companies. It applies to all companies who have European visitors to their websites. It applies to all companies that store or process data belonging to European citizens or European visitors. And like I said, GDPR is all about privacy and getting consent from your user before you start tracking them, before you start using their user information to optimize your platform, before you start using it to, yeah, maybe in some cases like improve your revenue as a company, or to just even show the name on the home screen. Like if a person like visits your website for the first time and you somehow get their information, like it's probably better to first ask whether it is allowed to do that. And GDPR goes far beyond the front end, obviously, but for the sake of this conference, I think it's like probably the best part to focus on the front end part. Um, so one of the biggest things that has been going wrong in like the front end implementations of GDPR and other privacy regulations is what is called the cookie banner. That's like the term that a lot of people use, and it's often outsourced to third-party vendors because teams don't get in prioritizing building their own system. So they're like, okay, let's Google cookie banner, and they see three big vendors or four big vendors, um, and they're like, okay, let's compare these and let's just choose the cheapest one or the easiest one to configure. And unfortunately, it's not always, and sometimes even just not performant. Like those companies, their prime interest is to keep you hooked in their system. Their prime interest is not giving you an as performant solution as possible. It's often hard to integrate. Like it's not necessarily hard to integrate on your website. Like showing a cookie banner is easy, but doing it in a compliant way, making sure that you listen to whatever a user tells that cookie banner. Like if a user says, yes, you can use my data, or no, you cannot use my data, like integrating into that response is often hard and is really expensive, both on the developer cost as well as you have to pay a company for showing a cookie banner on your page. And like at our company, we tried to like find a solution for this, and we mainly came back to like the basics for front end compliance. So like the first and most important part is like you need to have informed consent. And informed consent is something that comes from the medical industry, where it says that giving information doesn't mean that if a user consents or not, that it is an informed consent. Like you can use words like, for example, a general counsel can use like legislative words and certain like really obscure words that an non-native English speaker, or maybe even a native English speaker, wouldn't understand. And it's really key to give a comprehensible information, to give them information that the end user understands. Like if your user cannot understand what they consent to, in theory, their consent is not valid. Um, and the second biggest part is that you do not start using information, or you do not start tracking information before consent is given. Until a person gives their consent, you don't know what they will decide. So in that way, it's better to leave that open. And there needs to be the option to change a consent later on. If a user consents to giving their information now and they learn more about privacy regulation later, they should be able to withdraw their consent or at least change it. Um, and on top of that, if you want to have a performant compliance, like it's probably better for your cookie banner or the pop-up on your screen to not block rendering. Like I've seen many solutions where I would see a banner and then 4 or 5 seconds later, the white screen would change in something else. Because often those banners, etc., start loading earlier because the information is given is like, hey, put this JavaScript block in your head of your HTML document. So that's the first thing that gets loaded. It starts loading dependencies that it doesn't always need. And in that way, it just slows down everything without there being a valid reason for it. So it's probably better to just not block rendering, start asynchronously fetching it, like tell your browser that it's okay to first fetch the most important part to keep your users on the platform, to give your users some feedback on, hey, we are loading something, here's your content. Really focus on your own content rather than the content that is in that banner or in that pop-up. Only use those dependencies when you really need them. Like I've seen some solutions, for example, use jQuery, and there's nothing wrong with jQuery in itself, but it is kind of sad to load the whole system of jQuery to just have the animation of having your bar drop down, while you can perfectly do that with plain JavaScript and CSS. And another thing is like minify your JavaScript. Besides users that start digging into the HTML and into their element, like into their page, and seeing all your to-dos in your code, it's probably also better to load as little code as possible on the moment that it's live, because it will not change every second. So why would you not minify it and give your users a better and more performant experience? Um, and to make this easier, because not every team can necessarily implement their own solution, I went online and I started looking for some online resources, of which some of them are open source. So one is Osano. It was actually one of the first ones I found, and I'm a fan of them because they open source their GitHub, uh, like their code, but as well they created a generator in which you can just put in your text, put in the color of your buttons, and they will like show it to you what it will look like, and you can kind of use it that way if you don't want to host it yourself. A few other options is Cookie Consent Box, which is also open source. OpenBase also created a top 10 of JavaScript cookie consent libraries. Um, and then there's two GDPR, which is also, they also have a banner generator, but I could not find their source myself. So I'm not sure whether they're open source, but they're free and easy to use. So in that way, like there's there's definitely plenty of other options. And I'm not saying that you have to go to your boss now and say like, hey, let's change the way that we do our compliance. But I think it is a really important thing to make um, technical and non-technical people aware of integrating something as small as a banner that gets loaded after your page is loaded and what the implications are on the performance of your website. So that being said, I would want to thank you all, and like I hope you all get a better, more compliant, and more performant website now.